This is the RTNAR. So today in the RTNAR discussion, we're discussing a video where John spoke to, unfortunately, I'm going to have to call him some guy because I don't remember his name, but they were talking about a variety of metaphysical concerns around Whitehead. As always, I'll let, if anyone else has got a thought, you go first.
His name was Matt Segal, Velasquez.
Cool. So yeah, feel free to come forward with whatever.
I think you should go Velasquez first.
Should I?
Just for the first one to break the ice, yeah.
All right. So the main takeaway I had was that it's sort of I've got like a hodgepodge here. It's sort of, I'm realizing it's a bit disconnected. But the main one was the allusion to the whole Cartesian split of mind and matter. So, especially because I'm pretty sure Viveki goes over that in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. And it made a lot of... I remember it making a lot of sense with respect to why we're in a meaning crisis. I don't actually remember the specifics. So I think we should probably make a project out of making that clear. Although it seems, after talking to Struan, he's done a fair bit himself already. Yeah, anyone got any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, that is basically my wheelhouse as far as I can understand it. But just based on what my natural curiosity and interest in the subject is, I think that's a fair comment. Somebody else said they had one line. What was that?
I have it, and I can't explain it to you, but I can tell you the line. The virtue of reverence to the magnetic pull between emergence and reverence. So, in the third mind, I was thinking about the third mind with Greg, Jordan, and John when they had discussed the third mind, and that is kind of where it came to this. After I listened to that, and then this, I got the virtue of reverence to the magnetic pull between emergence and reverence. So.
The pole between emergence and reverence.
Yeah.
Could you illuminate how that's a pole?
A pull? Okay, so they use the infinity sign. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it sounds like you're using, when you say magnetic pole, you're talking about opposites like north and south, right? I think what Velasquez is saying is that emergence and emanation, those make sensible opposites, but emergence and reverence, that doesn't seem to be an opposition.
Okay, so they used, in the video, there was the infinity sign, and on one side was the emanation, and the other side was the emergence. So that when Matt talked about it, he showed a picture of the infinity sign, and those are the two things. And so that's where I got the magnetic pull from, because when I think of the infinity sign, that's what I think about.
Where's the reverence there?
Is the bridge between emergence and emanation.
Yeah.
Okay.
So they talked about virtues and what was virtuous.
Right.
That's what I got from the video. So.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No.
I don't know.
More
I
or
can
less makes
explain
sense.
it. Okay.
I have to be fairly brief today, but I think I can throw in on top of what Lynn just provided. Not probably as original as you, Lynn, but just from my notes, and this ties back to last week's conversation generated by Voloskin. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So John did one of his things where he kind of logically ties one thing to another, to another, to another, and comes up with some outcome. And my notes have it that he starts with rationality, and my recollection is that he's talking about the circumscription of rationality and the redefinition of it. In other words, maybe hearkening back to what you said at the start about Cartesianism, Voloskin, etc. John in the video described it as rationality is aspirational adaptivity, so that kind of almost biological frame that he puts on things. And here's the kicker. He said that must be tied to the cultivation of the virtue of reverence. And they start talking about the metaphysics of reverence. And the only note that I really stood out to me was that it must include the theological, which in a sense brings us to where we are, talking about religion that's not a religion. So from rationality, go ahead.
I have a question for you in that regard, because what do you mean by theological? I mean, it seems to me that many people have different ideas of what the subject means, and because everybody has different ideas, when we invoke the word, we don't actually have a common understanding of what is meant. And that's actually one of the perhaps problems with the RTNAR project, is that we're all coming at this from different angles. So what do you think of is meant by theology?
Yes, that's a great question. So let's do the word thing. Theological, someone's going to have to correct me. Maybe Manuel, can you do your etymology? But isn't it theos is God, logical is like the study of, etc. And let me run with this for just a minute, Struan, sorry. So inherent in the definition of theology, what does it mean to me? Inherent in that is the very fact that everybody has a kind of different take on God. And I'm just going to use the word God. I'm sorry. I know that it's a both controversial and vexed and frankly an exhausted term. I think that's also intrinsic, as you rightly point out, Struan, to this project. So in simple terms, theology means different people's thinking about God.
Okay. I just want to add to that slightly, because I've also looked up the etymology of theology, and the interesting thing, actually maybe Bloskin told me, but the interesting thing was that the root of theo is maker. So it's not just, when we talk about theology, we're not just talking about divinity. Talking specifically, at least from a historical context, when people decided to name God Theo, they were looking for the creative principle of the universe itself. And it's very interesting to me, because the whole conversation regarding Whitehead is his recapitulation of creativity. But actually, the very notion of creativity is right there in the concept of theology. I think, personally, it's why we have, all of our religious stories are creation stories. It's because we're worshipping creation. Not just because we have this idea that there was an origin somewhere, but because we've been worshipping the idea of the creative potential within ourselves, because that is how we have identified fertility, as opposed to barrenness and drought and what have you, and so that's been going on for thousands of years. And with respect to reverence, I don't know. I get the sense that what's missing here actually is a understanding of what the whole is. Like science has given us a very clear picture of the particularities, but we're at a total loss when it comes to the whole. And I don't really have an argument for that at this point, but that's just how I feel.
That's a great refinement. Thank you. I love it.
Well, can I say something?
Of course.
Because for sure, science seems a big part in the Vervaeke's worldview, and I guess probably in what RTNAR would be. So, is there any reverence out of that worldview, though? And how could we, if there's none, how could we maybe create some or find or you know what I mean?
So you're sort of pointing out that the scientific worldview doesn't have much reverence in it.
Well, no, I'm not. I'm just asking. I mean, because I'm. Of course there are, because it goes so deep. But
I mean,
maybe.
I would say yes.
Yeah.
That is sort of lacking in reverence to a certain degree.
Well,
I mean,
yeah,
I know that a lot.
On the surface, I would say.
I
Go
think
on.
that's a complicated issue, actually. I don't think that we should try and look at it in a simplistic way, because on the one hand, yes, I mean, science doesn't have any kind of sense of meaning. There are all of these numbers and formulas and whatever, and, matter is described as a certain amount of energy, but we don't actually know what that energy is. It's more a description of how it behaves. So you've got that on the one hand, but on the other hand, you do have the scientists, and they sit there, and you do get scientists with a genuine sense of wonder about the world.
Yeah.
And that is, well, I think what Vervaeke, I don't think it goes far enough, to be honest, but I think what Vervaeke would be arguing in favor of is the idea of this kind of scientific wonder about what the world is like, being part of a ritual practice in a religious setting, more or less.
Did you say scientific wonder, Struan? Did I hear that correctly?
Well, what I meant was like, somebody who, like Stephen Hawking, writing books about how, what possibly happened before the Big Bang. It's all speculative. There's no clear answer, but he was, clearly curious about it. He had a sense of wonder about it. Like it filled him. He kept wanting to grow himself to the point where he could actually grapple with these questions. And I think that's the general emotional kind of complex of feelings or whatever that Vervaeke is trying to unearth and bring into a ritual context.
And maybe that's the point that religions are missing, that kind of scientific wonder that you can bring about compared to the world.
Well, it would depend. I mean, I suppose you could definitely say that of the fundamentalists.
Yeah.
Could you sort of see fundamental? Yeah, I guess you could. You could see fundamentalism as like a scientizing of Christianity.
Yeah, sort of. It depends. I mean, maybe not a modern definition of science, but certainly an ancient one. Because science. Well, the root of the word science is the Latin for scientia, to see, and so it was. Science was an attempt to see into the world, fundamentally, and so. But it was understood as a rational project, right? And fundamentalism is all about trying to make religion like a rational kind of a, logical kind of a system almost, and then adhering to that logical system, as if adhering to that logical system is what's going to bring you salvation. So you have your doctrines, your beliefs, your creed, or whatever, and then you adhere to it, and then you try and behave in accordance to what you hold, and that's fundamentalism in a nutshell. So does anybody else have any other notes? Okay, so I do have a couple of notes myself. I don't know if it will be really discussion topics as such, but I thought it was very interesting, for example, that it was mentioned that Kant favored an immanent teleology in self-organizing systems, and that this kind of view of biological systems is coming back to the fore because a non-teleological explanation seems to be unsatisfactory, or a mechanistic explanation of life is unsatisfactory and incomplete. Anybody
You may
want
want
to
to
say
slow
anything there?
that one. You may want to slow that one down a little bit. They're big ideas, Duran. Are you referring to Kant?
Okay. Yeah, well, I'm not terribly familiar with content. Sorry, Soledad or Solid. Your microphone is picking up a lot of static there.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can maybe do something about it. Just perhaps if you're not talking, mute yourself. So that, yeah, great. Yeah, well, I'm not terribly familiar with Kant on this particular point. I'm more familiar with his distinction of not having knowledge of the thing in itself. So I can't really speak with any kind of expertise on this. But Viveki did speak about Kant and his idea of self-organizing systems in his RTNAR lectures, at least.
Yep.
So I don't know. Would it help to go over those ideas, or are you familiar with them?
Not explicitly. I'm a bit more like you. I know Kant is a beast, and you don't want to. You can get
Yeah.
lost
Okay.
in
So
the world of Kant
well,
unless you're careful.
yeah. So I don't think it would be very productive to go down a rabbit hole about Kant at this point. The bottom line is basically that you have, and with respect to Whitehead at least, or the project that he's chasing after. The problem was with the mechanistic science of the Enlightenment era, right? There's no room for anything acting on purpose, so everything is inert. The idea of teleology is this purposeful action. The problem is that we can't make sense of the causal loops of living systems without appealing to some kind of intentionality or teleology. The purely mechanistic description of life fails to actually describe the phenomena that we experience, and so therefore it's a short what this is telling us is that it is telling us that something about the mechanistic view of the universe is wrong, but we aren't exactly sure what it is. That's what I take it to mean.
Now relate that to RTNAR.
Right. So RTNAR, in sense, that's exactly it. It's trying to come up with, okay, so people are in a meaning crisis. Well, I would say, John disagrees, I think, but I would say in large part that is because of a loss of sense of purpose. And the fact that we have a worldview that does not speak about purposes is part of the reason why people, when they live through that worldview, then they start to feel like everything is purposeless. And I think those two things are related, because I think if you can't see your own purpose in life, then you are going to become disconnected and disoriented and be unable to make sense of your own action in the world.
If you are a thoroughgoing materialist and you believe everything is inert.
Yeah.
Well, that's what the worldview says. So if you operating according to the scientific worldview, those assumptions are in the language that you are using. So I mean, it shouldn't be surprising that it will bleed through, not even necessarily at a conscious level, but simply at a subconscious level, where your experiences eventually become filtered through that language.
Yes, absolutely.
It's sort of this weird thing where, obviously, few people know this. It is literally a case of you've set up your methodology in advance to basically push the purpose out. Then you've lived your whole life according to that methodology, and then you've wondered why you feel like there's no purpose.
Yeah, that's basically what's happened. And the thing is that, with respect to the Cartesian dualism, which they didn't really touch on too deeply in this video, but it gives everybody, the grammar itself causes everybody to cut the purpose out of everything, because you've got the mind and matter dualism, and the purpose can only be articulated from a subjective standpoint, so to speak. I don't know, maybe that's just stating the obvious.
But no, it's speaking to the sort of philosophical part of what we may need to do with RTNAR, which is like, because I've noticed. Well, yeah, of course. But so I've noticed that there's this sense we've got in I've just noticed a lot of people sort of are like compulsively objectifying. So it's as if they cannot accept their experience just as it is. They don't. It's like they don't want to live in a world where they're just experiencing things. They always have to interpret it into something objective. So it's like love is chemicals or some crap. So
Yeah, well,
the sort of philosophical part of RTNAR may be sort of addressing that problem, I suppose.
I think that's in large part what the appeal to the participatory kind of knowing is supposed to achieve, supposed to undermine that kind of emphasis on objectivity, which I think, I mean, science is kind of infecting science at the moment in a bad way. But I don't really know what you can do about that.
Yeah, I would say, and I'm going to have to excuse myself after this. I'm really sorry, but what you're touching on vis-a-vis participatory is correct in John's framework, because he's going to make a distinction between the real and the actual, which may be going to what Voloskin said as well about love, which is probably incredibly central to all of this project, if I was to be really honest. If you start making a distinction between what's real versus what's actual, and maybe in a simple term, if we said the actual is how Descartes boiled it down, whereas the real is what RTNAR is driving at, and maybe something like love is real, what falls out of that?
I guess it comes down to what you mean by real there, which is a
difficult
question.
Oh, yeah, I'm going to have to get back to my note on that. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have time to justify what I said, other than it's something that is a distinction that he makes clearly, and I have not justified it well enough. I'm sorry.
No problem.
Yeah, it's not something you need to apologize for necessarily, but I think it would be useful to you to get for you to get an idea of what you think is meant by reality, especially because I mean, the thing is that he argues that that the notion of reality has become so synonymous with actuality. So when you think, like, if you accept that premise as a naive Western speaker who hasn't actually investigated the topic, it's very likely that your idea of reality would then be what actuality is, right? And then if you investigate that, then you'll be able to have a better idea as to what the distinctions are and where you feel you particularly want to go. Because maybe you actually just want to follow in Descartes' footsteps in that regard. Who knows? Anyway.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it'd be unfair to kind of hit and run on this. So let me look it up. I'll give you my note on it, and then we'll have to go. I'm sorry. I'll mute until then.
Don't worry, looking forward to it. But I do think this ties.
Central parts. Go ahead, Strong.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say this ties into what was said in the conversation with respect to having to reinvent rationality and reality at the same time. And so, yeah, I was just going to open the door to exploring that topic. But I just, did you have something else that you wanted to say?
Yeah, before we moved on to the potentiality part, I thought the talk of Nietzsche in that regard was really interesting, where he thought there was not a lack of meaning there, but too much meaning and no way to differentiate them. And then John brought up the Nishitani as allowing for emptiness or potential as like a transperspectival space that gives a shared ground and space from which all the perspectives and meanings can be properly evaluated. And what I think you said, Alicia Raro argued that actuality and potentiality need to be given equal reverence, which they're currently not still in the West. And then finally, the connection to the Western notion of God, like Aristotle's, as complete actuality, which in a sense means it's like static and passive in a sense, which I think caused a lot of the problems. Whereas Whitehead is pointing to, I think, a useful shift toward viewing God as part of an evolutionary process, like Erigina's circular or the infinity model sort of thing.
Well, I have a question for you in that regard, because whenever I hear talk like this, it's like there's always something lacking. Like I'm not hearing the thing that is to be the target of reverence. And I understand that there needs to be a recapitulation, but I was wondering, do you have any kind of specific direction you'd like to take that into? Because, well, as I say, I feel there's a lack in general.
For an object of reverence within theology,
well, I mean,
evolving God.
Yeah, like, okay, so I mean, we've got all of this idea. So God needs to be changed. You know, like we can't have the static intelligibility. We have to go for the dynamic intelligibility, etc., etc., etc. It's like, okay, I accept all of that, but what does it actually look like in terms of day-to-day practice, or what it actually boils down to in terms of the doctrines that we would accept for our institutions and so on and so forth. Like I don't see those details, and I don't see how one would get to those details from what has been said so far.
Right. Well, I suppose they would imagine a more organic, like reciprocally participatory view of the sacred, but they could still use symbols in order to understand it. Like for Whitehead, creativity is the ultimate principle. Like his God, which he defines as the purpose is to create value in the world, and the teleology is toward beauty. And I suppose that's like somewhat subjective, but not entirely. So you could use some shared symbols for that, I would think.
Okay. Yeah, that's actually one of the other things that in light of the fact that I was speaking about the roots of the word theo, meaning maker, it was curious to me that Whitehead supposedly thought that God was a creature of creation. Like, how can the maker be a creature of making? That doesn't. It seems to be like circular almost. I didn't quite figure out how he did that. It seems strange to me, but anyway.
Yeah, I'm not an expert. I still need to read more of Whitehead, but before the video, I was reading a bit, and he was, I think, defining, like, he has a kind of, he doesn't have a dualism in the strict static sense, but he has a kind of thing that reminds me of your 1 and 0 sort of thing, where he talks about the objective feelings and content, and then the subjective feelings and content, the latter being value, and that God is constantly present within the actualization of each each occurrence as a kind of constraint on the subjective feeling or the value of every event at all times, which can be like prehended to varying degrees. But as far as like creation out of nothing, no, I don't think you would describe God as that sort of creator.
Yeah, fair enough.
Guys, and ladies, gonna have to excuse myself. I'm gonna give you my best effort at actual versus real, and then go. So I think when John talks about actual versus real, he's trying to split apart what we find mathematically measurable, like Galileo and Descartes' primary substance. But when John talks about real, he's talking about the transjective. In other words, I was just looking at his Evolve, Move, Play lecture, which is really good. And when he goes ahead and talks about participatory knowing, he's talking about graspability as the quality of something that's real. But is that objective? Is it actual? Not necessarily. but it's real. So I'm going to, in a very ginger kind of a way, say that my current take on what he means by real is something which can be in between subjective and objective as transjective, and it is what he calls a real relation or real relationship. So there's some sort of reality formed in the coupling. I know that's not totally satisfactory, but it's the best I've got for now. And I'm sorry, I'm obliged to have to go. So really good talking to you all. I'll see you again soon.
Catch you later,
See ya.
John.
Bye.
Yeah, actually, that's good. Bringing in the transjective, I think, because Whitehead, I think, has an analogous concept where he defines the presentational immediacy or the objective feeling or objective content as basically what Hume boiled down to when he went for radical empiricism, and then the causal efficacy of things was ignored by Hume, and that's more where value lies. But then to bind those two together, he argues
Sorry,
can you
what do you mean by causal efficacy?
basically just like the chain of causes in general, which Hume kind of got rid of with his radical empiricism.
Okay.
Which would also imply be a necessary condition for any kind of purpose as well, I would think. But to tie those two together, kind of the subjective and objective worlds to some degree, you would need some kind of symbolic reference, which in some sense I think could be argued to be kind of related to the imagination, but also I think you could tie it to the transjective as well. That's Whitehead's symbolic reference.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I just, well, I have some qualms about how transjectivity is being used as the bridge between objective and subjective, but in principle, I don't have. I mean, I think that's well, that kind of approach is in the right ballpark at the very least.
Yeah, they didn't go over this, so we can go back to parts of the video if you guys have things. I have a few things too.
No, well, yeah, if you've got stuff to add, by all means. But I mean, I don't necessarily think that we should just kill this discussion right here. But yeah, so it's also worth talking about, even if it is a bit of a deviation. But yeah, anyway.
Yeah, you just reminded me of your the fourth thing that's not transjective, but probably don't need to get into that.
Well, just what is it, very briefly?
I'm trying to remember what you called it.
Oh, you mean mine? Oh, yeah. So I had the projective. So it's the transjective and the projective that sit opposite each other.
I was interested in Vervaeke, I think, for the first time, saying that he thought of metaphysically that intelligibility is the metaphysical equivalent to relevance realization, which I hadn't heard him say before.
Yeah,
No, actually,
he crazy.
I think he said the opposite. I think he said that intelligibility is like the opposite pole of relevance. So, like, we've got.
Well, as I heard him say it, he didn't want to invoke a correspondence in a correspondence theory truth kind of way, but so I took it like it was more of a metaphorical correspondence. But the idea was that insofar as the universe itself is supposed to have the principle of intelligibility, relevance realization is to intelligibility as, yeah, I don't know, there's like but that's more or less what they have in common. So like relevance realization, I guess, is life's attempt at intelligibility.
Yeah.
Isn't relevance realization the way that our sense data is made intelligible? Isn't intelligibility the outcome?
Well, in part, but the point is that from a like what he says in, with respect to Parmenides and everybody else who followed in his footsteps, is that they intelligibility was assumed to be the ground of existence, and so everything the question then was, okay, so how do we go about explaining the intelligibility of the world? So yeah, from a philosophical game perspective, the game that they were trying to like play was to figure out the world by trying to explain intelligibility. Like if the world is intelligible and you could explain why the world is intelligible, then I suppose it stands to reason that you could explain a whole lot about the world itself. And so the strategy was to try and explain the world by explaining its intelligibility.
Whereas relevance realization fills in that role of being the start incidentally by just stepping back from intelligibility, saying you start an absurdity and then you realize relevance and then you've created intelligibility and then you go from there. And so you don't need to explain why the world is intelligible, but why the world is realizable. Relevance is realizable.
I think Viveki would push back on that particular way of looking at things, and I think that's precisely because he doesn't want he rejects what he calls the romantic and the empiricist opposition. So it's not that the world is neither a blank canvas upon which we paint ourselves, and the mind isn't a blank slate that is just that is written upon by society or whatever after we're born. He rejects both of those, and so what you're talking about sounds to me a little bit, I don't know if you mean it this way, but the way that you described it to me, it sounded like the intelligibility isn't out there in the world. The intelligibility is something that you add to the world. And I think Viveki would push it back against that. But, I mean, maybe I have the wrong read. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I was saying that, like, we don't start, like, we don't have access to the intelligibility straight away. But, like,
no, sure. That's something that we have to make, sort of. I mean, that's I would agree with you that relevance realization is meant to be the process that makes the intelligibility in that sense.
Yeah, but constrained by reality, of course.
Well, yeah, that just begs the question: what do you mean by reality again?
Yeah, well, yeah, okay. So if we're defining reality as this subjective thing constrained by an objective world, then I should say relevance realization is constrained by the objective or constrained by the actual, and creates reality. But yeah, I just misspoke in putting reality there.
Well, I wouldn't say you misspoke necessarily. It's just that it's unclear, like.
Yeah.
But this is going off topic a little bit, but also the conversations that John's having with Greg and Rikas about de-equivocating the language. That's an ongoing project, and I mean, as they do it, I think it's good for us to try and do the same, because if we don't, then, we'd have subpar outcomes. So.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the point that was being made explicitly a moment ago was our culture equivocates reality and actuality. And so when I try to say actuality and the word reality comes out, that's habits that have been ingrained that, yeah, we're trying to address. So thank you.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough. But I mean, it could also be that actually you think, well, reality and actuality are synonymous. We should allow for that as well in terms of making sure that the equivocation space goes away.
Yeah, sure. Sure.
Does anybody else have notes?
I had a point. Oh, well, this might not be notes, but another follow-on on the subject of what do we actually worship in terms of I can't remember whose point it was where you asked how they might fill in the gap of, like, great, but what does that actually look like? Does anyone remember?
The gap of what?
I think it was maybe you, Kadai, or someone was making a point, and then Strawn came in and said, that does sound good, that does sound like it's in the right direction, but it raises the question of, like, what actually is it that we worship or revere in all of this? but I can't remember what the point was being commented on. I just remember like, yeah, what did it say next? So if no one remembers, I can just say. But yeah,
It was the idea of God as evolving along with creatures, just like reciprocally. Which
yeah, right.
I agree with is necessary. Like it kind of ties to another note I made where they were talking near the end about how the solution is we need to imagine ourselves as being involved in the enactment of God or the divine now as participating in it, because again, I think Aristotle's older idea of God as totally actualized and passive eventually led to a loss of purpose once people kind of figured out most of the apparent laws of nature. Like there was not much more need for God, which I think was a major component of the meaning crisis. And then how they talked about ancient peoples felt the need to participate in rituals on a regular basis or the world would end. So it was participatory in that sense. And then that idea of enacting God also reminds me of Alexander Bard's idea of syntheism, creating God in the digital age. And he's also getting pretty hardcore into Whitehead recently. Interesting.
Yeah, that's awesome. So the point that I was going to make is just in the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis lecture series, there's this discussion of sacredness and the sacred. I don't remember what the sacred is, but as distinguished from sacredness. But sacredness was described as this thing that invokes awe and pushes you to the edges of horror, to fill the purpose of horror, but also protect you from it. And he said he claimed this important, necessary, and or sufficient feature of sacredness is inexhaustibility. So in terms of where you would look for a god to revere, a god to worship, or something sacred to worship, I think it would be something. Well, the claim that was made was that it's inexhaustible. I kind of contemplated three things that have always been have over time become more and more significant to me because of their inexhaustibility. Those three things are like the infinite detail of the world, that we can function in terms of these categories and abstractions, but all of these categories and abstractions that we're dealing with, you can look at this precise detail, and that's always being simulated, which just from a like software simulation perspective boggles my mind. The other is just the sheer scale that you can like look out, and the volume of the world is huge. And the third thing that seems inexhaustible is the combinatoric potential for emergence. And then those three things kind of multiply together to be, well, even more inexhaustible. So, but I don't think that that's an exhaustive list of inexhaustible things. Those are the three that stand out to me. And then these points of dynamical systems and participating in, like just imagining participating in the details of the world, that's a kind of meditative suchness practice. Participating in the vastness of the world is a kind of contemplative moreness practice, and participating in the emergence. I don't know what that would look like, but it sounds really beautiful. So, but I'm only making these connections now in terms of connecting sacredness and inexhaustibility to something that you actually participate in. So that might be interesting.
Yeah, I think that's really good. Bringing in inexhaustibility. Glad you reminded me of that term. So I'm guessing you would say of those three, the infinite detail is the moreness. The infinite detail is the suchness, the sheer scale is the moreness, and then the combination potential for emergence is, I guess, the third factor. As far as, is that right?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, the emergence is almost just pointing out that, like, if you have suchness and moreness at the same time, there's a lot going on. Yeah, so you could even see them as their conjunction.
Yeah, and then
What?
I think, sorry, Velasquez, I just wanted to say I think sacredness and the sacred differentiation was, I believe, sacred was like a symbol for sacredness, which may or may not be idolatrous, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, that was
So
it.
I would simply say that this sacred is suchness and sacredness is moreness.
Uh,
Yeah, because the sacred is a particular instantiation that's meant to lead you to the, sacredness in general. Particular sort of brings it pretty quickly, makes you think of suchness.
yeah.
But yeah, the whole like bridging the two. Someone said it was like emergence, emanation would too, wouldn't it? Emergence is suchness to moreness, and emanation is moreness to suchness.
Yeah, it's very interesting. A possible fourth.
Yeah, I think also that they were saying that Whitehead seemed to be a Neoplatonist, but not an emanationist, similar to Erigena, that mixture of the two that John was talking about with Jonathan Pedro.
Mixture of
And
the
that's
two.
I don't. Sorry.
Like, so what was this about? A mixture of the two?
That Whitehead, like Erigena, had that kind of infinity symbol, like the graph Matt Segal showed up between emanation and emergence, as opposed to Neoplatonism, which tended to be emanationist, if I recall.
Oh yeah, and they're sort of in. It's not like one is supreme over the other. It's a dialogic kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah, actually, that's the note I made, which was if you take that dialogic relationship as the sacred, and if you think of the universe as, the universe as coming out of the sacred, as in the dialogic relationship between suchness and moreness due to, like, through emergence and emanation, then you could sort of see like the point of life as to basically live the sacred. This is all maybe nonsense, but just going to throw it in anyway.
So how would
Well,
you
I think
describe
that was maybe the
living as
historical gist. Like, the whole idea of worshipping the gods was to be closer to whatever the portfolio the god was in charge of, right? So you worship the god of fertility so that you can be more fertile. But there was this whole emanation emergence thing, and not being an emanationist. Well, I don't know. Maybe this will be a bit too abstract, but there are like Viveki talked about the three orders, right? The nomological, the moral, and the narrative orders. The nomological order, so far as I understand, is the way that it's like the laws of the world, basically. Like the like E equals MC squared. That's like a law of the world almost. It's the way that the world operates, and it's a constant. The thing is that if you reject Neoplatonic emanation, right? The whole idea of the nomological order was that there was this hierarchy between what was sacred and what was profane, and so you have like matter, which, as Segal said, according to Plotinus, whatever, doesn't, strictly speaking, doesn't even exist, right? And then at the other, that's the profane arc, and then on the other end of the hierarchy is the one, or the contemplation, the form, or I don't know what you really want to call it, but the whole nomological order in terms of the hierarchy is actually built upon the idea that the emanation is superior to the emergence. if you undermine that, the question is what remains actually of the nomological order. And I was wondering if anybody had any thoughts about that, because it seems to me that if you do that move, well, then you flatten the entire hierarchy, because you can't say that emanation is to be privileged over emergence anymore. So it doesn't actually stand to reason that all of the potential or material stuff, or that it is actually inferior to what is, you know, most actualized or most realized or most real.
So from an emanationist account, how would you account for, like, taking Greg Henry case, emergence points, if you went back to a time period before, like organisms with brains, for example?
Well, yeah, I mean, the historical, as I understand it, the historical approach was basically Plotinus's approach. It's like, okay, well, the emanation is superior to the emergence. The emanation makes the emergence possible. Therefore, the emanation depends upon the emergence. I mean, sorry, the emergence depends upon the emanation. Therefore, it is superior. So, end of story. So it's not that the emergence isn't there. It's that the emergence is in some way treated as the impure or the inferior thing to be gotten rid of. You see,
Yeah.
so if you create the infinity sign between both sides, well then, you know, the idea that, okay, so that you've got God, and then you've got the angels, and then you've got humans, and then you've got animals, and then you've got the dead, you know, like inert matter, whatever you know. At each point, there's this, like, it's less actual, right? At least in theory. So it would seem that the nomological order is completely undermined by putting in that infinity between the emergence and the emanation. I was just wondering if anybody else saw that, or if they've got a way around it, perhaps.
I don't know if I'm familiar enough with Plotinus, but I'd imagine you can still have the thing Erigena and Whitehead are both talking about obviously allows for both to influence each other in that kind of top-down and bottom-up way. But maybe the question of whether the nomological order is, or rather the emanation is, like, morally valued more, is like a question of subjective interpretation. I don't know.
Well, I mean, that's just, the point is that, okay, so you had this idea of a great chain of being, right? Being. According to the description of this thing, the emanation is superior. It's not about whether or not it's subjective or not. It's a point. The point is that the story, if the emanation is superior to the emergence, the story of the chain of being makes sense. If you undermine the idea that the emanation is superior to the emergence, the entire narrative of this chain of being becomes nonsense. And so, if in effect, if you accept this dialogue between the two poles, then neither side is superior to the other, and this chain of being articulation becomes nonsense. And so that entire schema that made sense of the world in a way that people could interact with it goes away. And so then the question is, what do you replace it with?
I'm not sure whether it follows that having a dialogic interaction implies that one is superior to the other in some sort of like normative sense necessarily, does it?
No, I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying it doesn't. I'm saying that it actually undermines that premise, but that premise is necessary to have the idea of a great chain of being.
Yeah, I think what both John and Whitehead would say is that some of the more, like, static or fundamentalist dogmas failed to account for the bottom-up shifting, or like
I don't dispute that. I'm agreeing with you there. But I'm saying it creates a problem because now you can't make sense of the nomological order anymore. So you need a replacement. And I don't see what that replacement is at this point.
I mean,
like if you're going to have the idea that there are different degrees of realness, right? So that, for example, matter is less real than ideas, then you have to have an account of the world that has something superior to something else, and something that's inferior. If you don't have that, then that entire hierarchy, it becomes nonsense, and it's undermined. And so the question is how do you have an idea of realness if you don't have a hierarchy?
Well, I mean, for one, you could say that they each have different contexts in which they're relevant, like the ideal versus the material, rather than like a vacuum hierarchy necessarily. like the hylomorphism of Aristotle, like the form plus the material actual.
Right, but then the point is like, okay, so Viveki talks about reality and illusion, right? You don't want to be in the idea, you don't want to have illusion. But if you get rid of illusion entirely, if everything is real, right? So you've got matter and you've got form, and they're both equally real, then to have matter instead of form, or to have form instead of matter, there's no way to privilege either point, right? And so the question of, well, when are you deceiving yourself, or when are you in the realm of illusion if everything's real? Like the entire grammar of looking at the world this way stops to make sense. It falsifies itself, right?
Yeah, I would think that. I mean, maybe if you bring in the transjective again, it would need to like be a coherent relationship between the form and the matter, rather than what do you call it, like the confused or equivocation thing, which is one of the main causes of self-deception.
Yeah. Okay. So
The-
I mean, but what would it look like specifically that it would give a sensible replacement that allows people to act in the world?
Like the normative order. I feel like we might be equivocating the nomological and the normative order now that I'm thinking about it. Actually, could be seen as the proper fusion of the form and the material, such that they like create beauty in the way John defines it, for example.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can you can appeal to the normative order, but it doesn't really solve the issue of the nomological order being annihilated. I don't see like.
The story of the nomological order being annihilated, is this in some sense like exemplified by the postmodern post-structural critique of any attempt to make sense of the world, where you essentially deconstruct by saying, well, look, there's still some illusion here, so you haven't completely materially explained the world yet, where essentially the post-structuralists are raising empirical reality to such a high pedestal that none of your ideas, none of your theories are quote unquote real anymore. Like, is that analogous or exemplifying what you're describing?
No, it's a bit of a different issue. What you're talking about is taking somebody's standards and showing how they don't actually satisfy those standards. What I'm talking about is a different set of standards that completely render the previous set of standards nonsensical.
Well, I never mentioned like holding post-structuralists to their own standards. I was just saying they
No, I'm
take
saying
these standards.
the post-structuralists, when the argument that you're talking about, the post-structuralists, their hard empiricism and all of that stuff, it's part of their rhetorical strategy. They undermine somebody's standpoint by showing how the person fails to actually fulfill their own criteria that they set out, and therefore it's invalid. That's the post-structuralist move, because the structure, they always undermine the structure using the structure's own claims about itself.
Yeah, right. I see.
So it
But
seems
then,
like. Oh, go ahead, Travis.
could you have, like, if that's a separate issue, could you have done that to the Neoplatonic emanation argument back in the day as well? What would that look like?
I suppose you could have done it back in the day. I don't know how many people would have believed it or thought you were even talking sense in the first place. But I mean, yeah, I mean, you know, like if you want to really look at that kind of stuff, look at the Cynics, like Diogenes and so on and so forth. They had pretty similar kind of way of going about things as the post-structuralist, actually. But yeah, sorry, Gadai, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, unless Jarvis had another point, feel free to jump in. So it seems like regarding emanation and emergence, there's kind of 4 different combinations we could look at it, and I think you're critiquing one in particular. So first, you could have pure emanation only, which I don't think that's really one of the options here that we're considering seriously. I'm actually not even sure what theologians would have had that. Emanation plus emergence, but with a hierarchy of realness, where emanation is seen as higher in the chain of being, but emergence is also real. Third would be emanation and emergence are equally real, like that infinity symbol, and influence each other equally. And then emergence only, which I assume is kind of hardcore materialism. So I'm assuming that you're critiquing the third one, where emanation and emergence are seen as equally real and valued, and are arguing for the second one, where there is both real emanation and real emergence, but there's still hierarchy of realness where emanation is higher.
No. To be clear, I do not consider myself a realist. So I don't try and have a hierarchy of realness. I don't. For me, I don't know. Yeah, this is going to be really confused terminology, but sorry.
Sorry, hierarchy of realness is still a kind of an odd concept to me, unless you mean like the amount of detail. But go on.
Well, I mean, historically, that was, the entire Christian axial age worldview was predicated upon this hierarchy. It's kind of hard to miss if you start studying it seriously. So, yeah, okay. So speaking personally, I don't consider myself a realist, and that's going to be really, really hard to unpack. Let's say that I think matter is real, but mind is ideal, and so it's the arc, like the substance form axis is between what is real and what is ideal. And then, of course, you've also got what is actual and what is potential, and that's so I don't privilege what is real over what is ideal over what is real. They each have their own domains, and so in that sense, I completely flatten out the nomological order. But yeah, as I say, from my perspective, I think that makes sense, because I don't try and have realness as my norm. But the issue, like the thing is, okay, so I don't consider myself a realist, but I see a lot of people saying, oh, well, realism, realness, yada, yada, yada. And the question is, okay, so what does that actually mean? Because the old formulation made sense, but this new formulation is challenging the old formulation. I can no longer make sense of your claims of realness anymore. That there's a disconnect. And so I would actually say, well, maybe you guys should join my side of the fence and abandon realism, because that's the more sensible thing to do. And I mean, fair enough. Like I would say that Whitehead actually has a point with regards to the infinity symbol and the feedback and the crap. I learned a new word in Namek. That means when two sides are foes with each other, but they're not exactly contradictions. It's like life and death. It's like you can't have death without life, and you can't have life without death. But nevertheless, they kind of are at each other's throats. And I think, well, I wouldn't really use the hostility idea. I think but I think there is a similar kind of a one begets the other kind of a thing going on between emanation and emergence. So I actually like that part of Whitehead and Vervaeke's thinking, and I wanted to encourage it. I just think that has consequences for realism and for the nomological order, which, in terms of RTNAR, these consequences need to be considered.
Yeah, I agree. But would you not say that emanation could be construed as the idealism half?
Perhaps. I need to think about it, because the question is like, okay, well then, in terms of actuality and potentiality, where's the emergence and the emanation? Is it only something that is on between what is real and what is ideal, or is the emanation and emergence also in the actuality potentiality arc? And that's actually something that I haven't been able to figure out for myself yet. So, but I take your point. Like at least with respect to historical thinking, there's a very strong trend to associate the emanation with the general and emergence with the particular, and that would follow, with the material and formal distinctions, like between Aristotle's moderate realism and Plato's full-blown Platonic realism. It's a bit of an anachronism to call it that, but those are the distinctions. And I think that you're very much following in the same kind of tradition, and I think there's some validity behind that. Like I can feel myself wanting to make the same kind of moves, but as I say, I've just got a bit of qualms and trying to still figure it out.
Right. So you wouldn't say potential is, if not isomorphic, not even mapping to your definition of ideal, and actual as
No. Yeah, no. This is I'm trying to actually explicitly, for example, split possibility and potentiality. I would say possibility is what is ideal, and then potentiality is not. It's not like it's different. And so you see, this is exactly like people want to make the distinction. They want to talk about actuality and potentiality as if that's the whole story. Like they don't need to talk about any like what is real and what is ideal. And then the actuality and the potentiality together is taken as what is real. That's very much the approach that I see people trying to take. Maybe that's wrong. My perception, I mean. But so what I'm trying to do is to matter is real, mind or space is ideal, and then energy is actual and time is potential. And so the possibility as such would be it's more eternal, so like space, rather than the potentiality of time. Sorry, I hope that wasn't confusing.
No, you just reminded me of those four. Yeah. Let me know, Velasquez, if this is getting too far off track, but I was curious if you mean possibility is, would you say that's like infinite, and potentiality is more like getting close to actuality? Because I kind of see those as a spectrum where possibility is like in theory possible, and then potential is you're getting closer to a particular line of a timeline where something is able to be actualized.
Yeah, I don't know. That's kind of hard for me to fit. Like, yeah, I think if I try and respond to the way you framed your question, I'll be misrepresenting my own position. So I know that a lot of people they tend to see like potentiality as a refinement of possibility. I'm not trying to think of it in that way. I'm trying to think of it. Well, possibility is that it's static, and potentiality is dynamic, basically. And so the real and ideal are polar opposites that together make up the I would say the axis of intelligibility. I don't really have a good word for the dynamic axis yet, but let's call it agape, or perhaps relevance. The other that bridges between actuality and potentiality, and so you have to understand the four together in order to actually be able to figure out my worldview, basically. I don't know. Yeah. Was that? Sorry.
Idea, static and dynamics for possibility and potentiality.
Yeah. So you see, it's like there's a the way that I look at it almost is like space is like the false existence and matter is the true existence. In that space is the absence that allows the presence. Is the possibility for the reality, right? It's like it's only because of the non-existence that space has that the existence of matter can actually fill that space. And so they are opposites, but in their opposition, you can actually make sense of them. It's like without the opposition, it would all be you wouldn't be able to make sense of it. And I think that there's the same kind of a dichotomy going on between energy and time. And so there's the thing that you see now is the actuality. But the thing that you can't see because it's not actual is the potentiality which stretches across time, which isn't, it's inactive in some sense. But you've got to, I don't know, it's hard for me to find the words here, but so I mean I'm trying to make it explicit exactly what the idea of potentiality would be as divorced from anything that is static in the sense of possibility or what is ideal. Because I think that way of talking is actually just it's more effective. It allows people to think to function better. But I mean that's just a guess on my part.
So you would say possibility has been static since the beginning of time, like it's an eternal set of possibilities?
I would say that's the right way to look at it. I don't know if it is actually that way. I think that there's well, this actually gets back to one of the things in one of the notes that I had, that Heidegger's project is extending phenomenology into ontology. Like, the question is how do we as living individuals actually interface with the world? Like, it isn't just that this happens automatically or that it is simple. Like, there are these complex structures that we have been built out of that make that make our way of looking at the world possible. And I think so. I wouldn't necessarily say that the same possibilities have eternally been there, but I do think that there's something about the way that we think that compels us to look at it that way. And if you want to actually engage the world in a healthy manner, then you have to accept that that's something that's just a bias that you're going to have to live with, basically. So I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and provides a new point.
Well, yeah. Sorry to bring in the Heidegger stuff. So I think Heidegger was trying to when John says that he was trying to put phenomenology into ontology. I think that's the same move that I'm trying to make here with trying to push the first person into the third person, so that I demand that any attempt to account for the third person actually is also an account of the first person, account of the third person. And I'm sorry, that sounds a bit circular, but
yeah, say that last part again, can you?
I think the idea, like, if you're trying to push phenomenology into your ontology, right, then you're trying to give an account of the third person point of view that is also an account of the first person account of the third person point of view. In other words,
Right.
you're taking responsibility for your own limitations in what you look at, and that is explicitly part of what you describe when you describe what you're looking at.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think yeah, I was gonna say I've got one other note, but I think it's actually weird how many things we just covered without me having to bring it up. Yeah, so I'm all out almost. Any other notes?
Yeah, I have a couple minor ones too, but if anyone else has any.
Well, actually, there is one other thing. I just noted the failure of a non-creative ontology is for Gödelian reasons. I'm kind of speculating because I'm not familiar with what John's talking about. Well, I mean, I'm familiar with Gödel's incompleteness theorems, but I'm not specifically familiar with the historical background of who discovered this and whatever. But what I think is going on there is, well, Gödel's incompleteness theorems was basically the attempt to unify all of the mathematical propositions that exist into a complete system. The problem was that every single time to create this system, what you ended up with was a statement. This statement is false, and the fact that that self-refuting statement was possible within the language undermined the validity of the entire language. So I guess what they're talking about with respect to a creative ontology is that it would allow for something to be false at one time and not false at another, so that it wouldn't, like, you wouldn't the changing nature of the system would mean that you couldn't ever nail anything down with finality, and so that there would always be relative islands of meaningfulness. But I wonder, like, yeah, I don't know. This kind of gets into the whole nomological order thing, because it seems to me that what Gödel's conclusion is that you can't describe truth in terms of falseness, and you can't describe truthness truth in terms of, falseness in terms of truth and truth in terms of falseness. So those two, the very attempt to have an intelligible world would force you to divide the world into a true and a false world. Like I think in some sense trying to build your ontology out of intelligibility is precisely what creates the actual age 2 world grammar. And the thing that we are confronted with now is that the scientific revolution has actually undermined the very idea that we could orient ourselves towards intelligibility and live a fruitful life. I don't know, maybe that's a little bit too out there.
Maybe clarify that last part, because how does science undermine our ability to orient towards intelligibility?
Well, because science is, okay, at least in terms of the scientific worldview, the scientific revolution that is like in large part created by Descartes, then you've got the dualism, right? And then there's no meaning or purpose in the matter, and the scientific worldview only looks at the matter and stuff. And so the point is like Hume made a similar argument with respect to is and ought. There's no way to get to an ought from an is, at least logically. There's this gap. And so what science tells you is what is, but it doesn't say anything about what ought to be. And the fact of the matter is that if you hold intelligibility as your ought, then you are left with this, well, then all you end up with is, but there's no oughtness in the is, because every single time you try and look at the is, you find there's no ought. And so you're effectively isolated from your own ought. And it is this lack that science, because everybody says be objective, look at the facts, but the facts never speak about the values. And the values have always been left out, and it's the language of values that we are lacking now.
So I'm very interested in formal logic, and I can speak to Gödel a little. I think that Gödel's incompleteness theorem is actually contained within the is, like it's a failure of the is on its own terms, which is if you set up a if you set up some symbolic grammar that describes propositions, and that proposition, that grammar is sophisticated enough to describe arithmetic, then it's possible to describe unprovable statements, which doesn't mean that they're false. It just means that it means it's impossible to reduce your standard of truth to a deductive system. So there's this chain of problems. There's the ought from an is problem. Then there's then even if you disregard the ought, there's the is from deductive logic problem. And then even if you disregard that and you stay completely within the deductive realm, then you still have to face Gödel's incompleteness, where I don't know how to frame it as a blah from a blah, but essentially you can't create an ultimate deductive system and say things are deductively true if they're provable in this system without coming to statements that can neither be. There are statements that are neither deductively provable or deductively refutable. Yes, which means there's a conflict entirely within deductive reasoning. Never mind the fact that there's a gap from deductive to inductive, or that there's a gap from inductive to normative. So I don't know. So I find a lot of the time when people appeal to Gödel, they're appealing to Gödel as a symbol, as a metaphor, which may be partly what's happening here. I don't know if that technical refinement of what Gödel was actually saying, it might not undermine the symbolic argument, but I'm interested in whether it undermines or refines the technical argument you were making.
No, well, I think the thing is that the point is that the attempt to divide the world into a true world and a false world is what you get when you adhere to the norm of intelligibility. And as I was saying, what Viveki was saying is that Parmenides and Plotinus and all of these other people, they tried to build an ontology out of intelligibility. So in that sense, intelligibility was their norm. In other words, they made the is their ought. Like I'm not saying that they tried to derive it. I'm saying they explicitly said is our ought.
Yeah, interesting.
Like so you've got like the entire rational, or the history of philosophy and the rationalization of the mind can be seen as trying to make the is our ought, and then Gödel's incompleteness theorems is like finally the acknowledgement that this is going to fail. Like it's absurd.
Yeah, I like that.
But then you see, so from my perspective, this has questions, because then, if holding to the norm of intelligibility requires you to divide the world into a true world and a false world, and if the scientific worldview shows us that this division of a true world and a false world is actually unsustainable, then where does that leave us? And it leaves us like in the middle of fucking shit creek without a paddle. That's the meaning crisis, basically.
I still feel like there are gaps between like what Gödel's incompleteness theorem talks about, like being surrounded by academics. You see a lot of people who have that desire to move in the direction of like deductive completeness, and like it seems like you can like Gödel's incompleteness theorem just uses deduction to show you can't go all the way, but I feel like you don't want to go any of the way, and I don't think Gödel's incompleteness theorem has stopped mathematicians from obsessing over deductive true versus false reality. They've just accepted that that they won't be able to finish the project of true versus false. But yeah, it's still very interesting that like Gödel's incompleteness theorem is only a threat to people because they started equivocating, reality with their intelligibility in the first place. And yeah, that's very insightful.
I don't think John would say that that there's a lack of a false world, in the sense that he sees like self-deception as both false in terms of the is, and negative in terms of an ought. Like it's the lack of a transjective participatory relationship to reality. So in that sense, there's kind of still a fusion of the is and the ought. Whereas if someone maybe tried to bring back purpose, but kept it separate.
But where's John's false world? There isn't one. So what is the meaning of the illusion exactly? You can't pin it down. It becomes unclear.
I think it would be more of like a false reality, in the sense of having a false relationship between the self and the world. Like a mismapping of coherence.
Right, but so then, but okay, so but this is the issue then, right? Because if the scientific worldview is showing us that there's no inherent teleology in things, that there's no purpose, that you can't infer the purpose, then there's no prospect of a mismatch, because it is you that is generating whatever purpose you see. And so what could you hold it against to show a mismatch?
I would think it would need to bring back like the phenomenology of the subject, like their own transjective apprehension of reality, rather than treating it as the objective empiricist fallacy that he talks about.
Right, but what are they apprehending at that point?
When they're in self-deception?
No, how do you determine the self-deception? What are they deceiving themselves about if there's no if what they so like where is the mismatch between what and what?
I would think between what is I think you could bring the relevance and relevance realization into this part, and you could argue that relevance could be construed as the ought part of the equation, I think.
Yeah, but okay, so if it should be relevant, then the idea is that it's relevant to me, right? So it's once again, it's me personally, if I find it relevant. So, for example, if I don't want to live anymore, well, then all of the stuff that could kill me, it's no longer relevant. Like, am I deceiving myself because I don't want to live anymore? The idea of talking about this in terms of truth and falseness falls away. And that's, you see, I'm saying if you no longer have this division between true and falseness, then fundamentally realism, like as a cultural cognitive grammar, it fails to satisfy.
I don't know if I could speak to that example very coherently, but I guess, I mean, I've heard
Yeah, sorry.
Paul Vanderklay make the argument against Sam Harris in the sense that bringing things back to the reality of the subject for norms makes it, you know, purely individualized, but that still fails to take into account the fact that given the shared set of human biology and so on, and the way the mind works, there's generally going to be a large degree of what is relevant that is shared intrinsically, and then the higher or the more I forget if John has a term for like good relevance realization.
I don't dispute the fact that there will be, like, you know, a consensus, and that there will be outliers, and that people will be able to, you know, get rid of the outliers because, well, you're an outlier and we don't want you, and that kind of thing. I don't dispute it. The point is that you can't tell the outliers, well, you're suffering from self-deception. Like, that claim just doesn't make sense anymore.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember how John has described like good relevance realization from poor, which I guess you could say brings back a separate kind of value, but I think he would answer something like that, which I would agree with him. Like wisdom.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I would say, yeah, I suppose you would probably say something about wisdom, but the thing, if we're talking about concrete particulars here, then I would say that how does he put it? Making meaning is making meaning makers, because we are meaning makers. And so the idea is, you see, it's kind of tautological, that we ought to make meaning, and that we make meaning by making meaning makers. And so it's once again, that's the kind of the fertility and the making kind of idea coming to the fore again, as far as I see it. And I don't dispute that. I think that's right. It's, you know, there's something deeply accurate about it, but that's not, you don't articulate that in terms of truth and falseness.
Well, I think we've gone over this slightly before. I think you could say that increasing the amount of meaning and meaning makers, which is the only intrinsically relevant thing, also increases the total amount of intelligibility being transjectively like not perceived but participated in by more individuals. So in that sense, maybe you could make the total increase or the total amount of intelligibility as the norm or the ought, and then use that definition of agape to feed it back on itself.
Yeah, but the problem is that when you adhere to that norm of intelligibility in a personal way, then you get up, you hit the Gödel's incompleteness theorem problem, and then the whole thing just falls apart because the grammar doesn't make sense anymore. Like, that's my objection.
It seems like there's like two reasons to disagree with someone though, and if the people you're criticizing equivocate these two things, then that's a fair criticism. But would you agree that like if someone's born with some innate desire to end their life, or no innate desire to preserve their life, that you can't claim that they're deceiving themselves when they act in a self-destructive way. But at the same time, like, in fact, it's possible that they're simply definitively not deceiving themselves. They're actually acting rationally. But at the same time, it is possible for someone to not be innately self-destructive and still bullshit themselves into self-destruction, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see why that wouldn't be possible. What's your
I
point?
think here you just need to break down the concept of the self, and then, like, for example, Plato's the monster, lion, and the man, to problematize people claiming that they know they want to harm themselves.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess in some sense, there's some part of them that does want that outcome, and they're just like resolving the conflict between internal parts of them by submitting to some self-destructive part. But I mean, that's kind of beside the point, which is just that I guess I'm trying to refine Stern's, well, my understanding of Stern's criticism that, like, it's not that self-deception doesn't exist. It's that you can't reduce all disagreement to one person is wrong and the other person is right. And in that sense,
Right,
like,
and the attempt to do that, well, yes, and the meaning crisis and the historical development has actually been. You can see it in our history. It's like people have been trying to behave according to that norm, and it's failed. And we are here today in the rubble of the failure, trying to like figure out, well, wait, what's next? At least that's how I see it.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
So if someone harmed them, if they were just under the influence of like a shallow module, harm themselves, couldn't you argue that they're decreasing their capacity for meaning and intelligibility, and therefore they ought not to? Or if they're getting into
Well, I mean, yeah, but I mean, I don't really see how that solves the issue. I mean, like, I could argue, well, you ought to worship God, so, jump into the sun. It's, what's the difference?
Because if you're making if you're like taking making is your ought all the way through, like, in a more comprehensive sense of intelligibility, rather than like the empiricism or romanticism, then you could argue that someone who's harming themselves or others or becoming addicted is decreasing their capacity for meaning making and intelligibility, and therefore they ought not to.
But you're just upping it in the stack at that point. You're not resolving anything. Just saying, well, okay, so the is-ought distinction is one level up.
Yeah, I don't see what that would. You can obviously say it, but I don't see what it would accomplish. It's not gonna. I mean, if they disagree, it's not the. I don't think that if you say to everybody, well, live according to this way of life, and if you see that they're decreasing their own intelligibility, well, then they're harming themselves or whatever. I mean, yeah, you could say that, but I don't think ultimately that it works. I think that ultimately, if everybody tries to live that way, they discover things that completely derails their faith in the system as a whole.
Living according to the ought of increasing meaning.
If you're making the ought, if you well, no, that's something else, isn't it? That's not making is your ought in terms of intelligibility.
Increasing the amount of intelligibility, like increasing the
Right.
amount
So
of...
are you? But are you drawing? Are you saying that meaning and intelligibility are one and the same thing?
Well, I mean, there could be meaning that is intelligible to others but not you, but like people can't really access it without it being intelligible to them, right? So it wouldn't really be relevant. So it's like you need both.
Yeah,
maybe.
but hang on. Saying that intelligibility is a necessary part of meaning isn't the same thing as saying that intelligibility is meaning.
Right.
So I don't know, like, I don't want to make that claim, personally. Maybe you do, I don't know. Some people I think do, but I don't like that. So I wouldn't. Well, yeah, and that's my whole discomfort, because I think that people that do make that move, then they use intelligibility as an excuse to create a hierarchy, and then they start bashing other people over the head with that hierarchy. And well, ultimately, it just doesn't work. It can't live up to its own standards. To borrow about, from what I've learned from the post-structuralists, I guess.
So when John talks about Susan Wolf's idea of making meaning and meaning makers as the only thing that's intrinsically relevant, you think he is primarily talking about what you're defining as meaning or intelligibility there, with his definition of agape, kind of?
No, I think that's something that's speaking to something that is beyond intelligibility. And I mean, I don't mean unintelligible. I just mean it's not expressly aimed at intelligibility. It's meta intelligible.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of like a gradient between just pure intelligibility, like as a somewhat irrelevant fact, and then deep meaning, but they're all necessarily intelligible in order to be like perceived by a person.
Well, I could say that intelligibility is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And that's I mean that in a deep sense that gets to what my grievance with respect to realism is.
Yeah, so if you added in meaning or an ought, how do you connect it other than intelligibility being necessary but not sufficient? How does that resolve the gap between the is and the ought, even if you do bring back meaning?
Well, then the is necessary and the ought is sufficient. So it is the gap. It's like it's basically partitioning the two, and then then the question is, well, what is the relationship between necessity and sufficiency? And that is the question. As far as I'm concerned, maybe that's exactly the world is exactly the relationship between necessity and sufficiency. I don't know. Maybe that's entirely unhelpful.
Well, it still, I guess, brings the question of where you're getting the ought from, aside from like innate biology.
Okay. So, well, I mean, I'm no. Yeah. Okay. So you're looking at the innate biology and you're saying there's an is, aha, right? So, what I would say in response is, for me, the is dynamic. I mean, sorry, the is static and the does is dynamic. And so if I'm getting an ought, I'm not getting it from the is, I'm getting it from the does. And so that's also, I mean, that's moving away from I beg pardon?
Did you say that last part again? The does?
Yeah, so you've got like you've got being and becoming, is and does, right? So the noun and the verb. So I say the norm with respect to acting, it's going to come from the verb, not the noun. It's like, I mean, it's to me, it's almost self-evident. It's like, obviously.
Yeah.
Because you need the norms make sense of the verbs, not the nouns. And you see, but the attempt was with respect to this chain of being and and the nomological order and this and the realism and the intelligibility was to create, well, truth is the good and falseness is the bad. I'm saying no, there is truth and falseness, but there is also good and bad, and these are kind of orthogonal to each other.
Right. Yeah, I thought it was also interesting that Whitehead, they were talking about him thinking one of the most important tasks of philosophy in the modern world is to secularize the function of God. I don't know if you guys wanted to discuss that also.
That seems to me like well, yeah, I don't know. That's a cute terminology, but I kind of think that it's a contradiction in terms. But I don't know. I mean, what do you mean by secular?
I mean, sort of like what both Vervaeke and Jordan Peterson were trying to do. Like, it's not the end point because it doesn't imply in and of itself the reverence for the sacredness that's necessary for, well, for even just the adaptational rationality John was talking about. But it can get people to reflect upon why that is necessary in the first place, and then eventually get to the point of worship or reverence.
Yeah, I understood it as you've got the function of God, and you're trying to synthesize it with. Well, it says secular, but I'm thinking of like maybe the
Scientific
intelligibility
worldview?
norms. Yeah, the scientific worldview, basically. So, because at least at the moment, it seems to me it's just like, well, they're non-overlapping magisteria that just are like
Well,
don't even touch each other.
I would say that I like your thinking, but I think at the end of the day, based on what you're trying to do, this sounds to me like you're trying to get the ought from the ears again. I mean, I don't have a problem with what Peterson or Vervaeke are doing, obviously, but I don't know. Just the way of phrasing it in terms of secularization, I think that's a fool's errand.
Well,
Is the goal just compatibility?
Well, I suppose, yeah. I mean,
I think it's just a way to make it viable. Like,
yeah,
the point
I
is
I certainly accept the idea of a recapitulation of God in more modern terms, or in terms that a modern person could understand it and function, and like enact the functionality of it. I don't. Yeah. So, but I probably just nitpicking over the phrasing. That's all.
I think it's reasonable to point out the phrasing might not be optimal, but I do feel like that was sort of what was meant. Recapitulating.
Yeah. No. Sure. I don't dispute that for a second.
Yeah, there was one other minor point I had. The last one was just that John, I hadn't heard him mention before that he wanted to add exaptation as the fifth E to 4E cognitive science, and with the brain circuit reuse hypothesis, and how cognition is like deeply analogous to evolution and emergent from it. I don't know if he talked about any of that before, but I hadn't heard it.
He's mentioned it once or twice. It's not a big thing though. Well, it depends. I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm not entirely happy with it, but yeah.
I feel like it could be useful in hashing out more specific things, because that kind of thing will sort of help maybe with stuff like symbolism or something like
Yeah,
that.
well, actually, yeah, no, I just wanted to bring that up. It actually maybe there's a lot of potential in it because, well, that exaptive tendency would really explain why, for example, you have 80% agreement that what was it again? That circle is good and square is bad or evil. The exaptive nature of cognition could precisely be what the cause of that is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it also might be important for like specifying different religious traditions for what is viable for different people, depending on what like frameworks they've grown up with. Especially, I don't know, I haven't looked into it, but if the brain circuit reuse hypothesis is somewhat dependent on age, like if there's much more synaptic pruning during like adolescence or something, and therefore certain symbols and frameworks for sacredness are going to be more or less viable for people, which I think it's kind of an argument for pluralism to some extent.
Do we have confirmation on whether that's true or that's just manifest?
What's true?
Well, the adaptability of the brain, has there been a physical causal link?
Yes, it has. At least if you can, well, you can, for example, people with bad epilepsy, like I think it's before the age of 7. People, well, there's 2 age gaps if I remember really correctly. Like there's the gap between 0 and 2 years, and then 2 years and 7 years. And there's crap, now I can't remember exact specifics, but there's like a difference between exactly how severe the operation can be and still have a person recover from it. After 7 years of age, it starts getting very, very dicey. And the point is that at that very young age, the brain is so plastic that if you lose one hemisphere, the other hemisphere can actually grow so that it takes over those operations. It's still young enough. But if that happens in your older age, well, you're going to suffer seriously if you lose a hemisphere.
Well, yeah, but that's not an argument against or for.
Well, it's
Yeah.
proof that it happens.
Right, sure, but
The exaction.
I already conceded that it happens, right? Like I'm trying to figure out the reason that it happens, right? Like, cause you could just say, right? Like when you have more structure, changing structure is more difficult, right? And especially if you have like dependencies upon dependencies upon dependencies, if you take away fundamental dependencies, you might like collapse the whole system, right? So that would be an argument for reduction in adaptability, but that also it might be an argument for not having certain dependencies, right?
Like what, for example?
Well, you have developmental stages, right? So the developmental stages are, in my opinion, the having a sufficient way of relating on one level so that you can build a meta level on top of it.
Right. So, but by that, using that metaphor, if you're getting rid of dependencies, you're effectively keeping people in a childlike state because you're denying development.
Not necessarily, but like that is a different discussion.
Well, then, yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm not sure what you're talking about. Maybe you're talking about different things then.
Well, I'm first talking about the principle, and then we can discuss the validity of having alternatives later. Like I don't think they need to be in the same discussion.
I mean, I think you're saying that you'd want to have enough resiliency by not having too many like excess connections.
Well, I mean, in this context, I think the resiliency is the existence of the excess connections. Precisely why after the pruning you don't have the resiliency anymore. It's because you've lost the excess.
Actually, yeah. So there would be a decrease in adaptability after adolescence, correct?
Yeah, it's like from my mind, it's a trade-off. It's like, yes, you lose the malleability, but in exchange you gain the proficiency. Like, you know, expertise has to, you have to solidify expertise at some point in order for it to become expertise.
Yeah, so it would be an increase in efficiency at the expense of resilience.
Perhaps. Yeah, I suppose. I don't know. I need to think, like, every single time John uses those terms, I think he's using it the wrong way around, and like my brain just flips around, and so I've got to like look at that really carefully there.
So I think that, I was going to make a large point.
Really,
if you want to have it fall, go ahead.
just one quick. So, do we have any more notes on the video? Because we're almost at 2 hours, and it seems like it's a fair time to finish the recording.
Yeah, I'm tired of discussing the video at this point. I don't know if anybody else has anything to add, but I think we can call it.
I mean, it wasn't from the video directly, but it was about that last point we were making.
Yeah, exaptation.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm happy to continue the conversation. I'm talking about whatever we're talking about now. It's like I've mined whatever it is out of the video, and I'm happy.
Okay, well then we'll just put an end to the recording. Thank you everybody for listening to this discussion, and I hope you'll tune again in next week.